Only 4 people knew what was said that night, and for 30 years, none of them talked. Not because they were told to stay quiet, not because of contracts or lawyers or studio pressure, because some moments are too real for Hollywood, too raw for an industry built on fiction. This is one of them. 2 of the most dangerous men in Los Angeles, 1972. One was the coolest actor alive. The other was a 6-time world karate champion who had never, not once, been knocked down in competition. They stepped away from the cameras, away from the crowd, away from everything that made them famous. And what happened next became the kind of story that only survives in whispers. Rewind. To understand what happened that night, you need to understand who these 2 men actually were. Not the characters they played on screen, not the posters, not the myths Hollywood packaged and sold. The real men. Steve McQueen was an energy torrent of a man. He could drive motorcycles across the desert for fun. He trained obsessively. He was physical in a way most actors only pretended to be. But more than any of that, Steve McQueen had an ego the size of the Pacific. Not a petty ego, not an insecure one. The ego of a man who had clawed up from absolute nothing, a broken home, reform schools, the Marines, and become the highest-paid actor on the planet. That kind of ego doesn't ask for a room, it assumes it owns one. Now put Chuck Norris in the same room. Chuck Norris in 1972 was already a legend inside the world that mattered most, the martial arts world. 6-time undefeated middleweight karate champion. He had trained alongside Bruce Lee. He had founded his own style, Chun Kuk-do, built from years of absorbing Tung Soo-do in Korea during his Air Force years, then spending the better part of a decade perfecting it in the dojo while the rest of America was watching television. He wasn't famous yet, not to the public, but to anyone who knew how to fight and to anyone who trained fighters, Chuck Norris was already untouchable. That contrast was the spark. They crossed paths because of Bruce Lee. That's the thread that runs through everything in this story. In the late 1960s, Bruce Lee had become the most sought-after martial arts instructor in Hollywood. Not because celebrities wanted to learn self-defense, because training with Bruce Lee was status. It meant something. James Coburn trained with him, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar trained with him, and Steve McQueen trained with him. McQueen was a serious student. Don't get that wrong, he wasn't there for the photo opportunity. He sweated in that gym, he took the hits, he came back. Bruce Lee himself acknowledged that McQueen had genuine ability, real speed for a non-martial artist, real commitment for a man who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. But Bruce Lee also trained Chuck Norris. Different relationship, different level entirely. When Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris stepped on the mat together, it was 2 professionals testing each other. 2 men who had spent their entire lives developing their bodies into instruments of precision. Their sparring sessions were quiet, clinical things, pure martial conversation between equals. When McQueen trained with Bruce Lee, it was a student and a teacher. McQueen was smart enough to know the difference, and that knowledge did something to him that he didn't like. Here's something most people don't realize about Steve McQueen. He was terrified of being ordinary. Not of failure, not of death, not of losing money or losing roles. He'd survived all of those. What McQueen couldn't stomach was the idea of being less than the man standing next to him. His wife, Neil Adams, later said it plainly. Steve had to be the best at everything he touched. Racing, acting, writing, fighting, everything. So when the conversation started circulating in Hollywood circles, whispers that Chuck Norris was something beyond what Steve McQueen was doing in that gym, something shifted inside him. And Steve McQueen was not a man who let things quietly shift. The exact location that night has been described differently over the years. Some accounts say it was at a party in Bel Air, one of those sprawling Hollywood gatherings where the guest list read like a film industry directory, and the conversations got dangerous after midnight.
Other accounts place it at a private gym facility used by several of Bruce Lee's students. One source, years later, suggested it happened after a karate tournament that both men had attended in separate capacities. What's consistent across every account is the sequence of events. McQueen and Norris had been circling each other for months, not with hostility, not openly. It was more like two alpha animals becoming aware of each other's presence in the same territory. Polite, professional, watching. The martial arts community in Los Angeles in the early 1970s was surprisingly small. Everyone knew everyone. Word traveled, and word had been traveling about Chuck Norris for years, specifically about what he could do with his hands and feet at a speed that cameras struggled to capture. McQueen had heard it all, and somewhere in the private architecture and his ego, he had filed it under, "We'll see." That night, they found themselves in the same space. The stories differ on how many people were present. Some say a dozen, some say fewer. What they agree on is that the room had that particular electricity that builds when two strong personalities occupy the same air. They talked, normally at first. Chuck Norris has described McQueen as sharp, intense, the kind of man who looked at you like he was already deciding something. McQueen had that quality, the assessment. He was always measuring, always calculating the distance between where he was and where he needed to be. And that night, the distance bothered him.
Nobody recorded exactly how the challenge began. That's deliberate. The people who were there understood what they were watching, and they understood that some things don't get written down. But the shape of it has survived. McQueen had been watching Chuck Norris move all evening, not with fear, with curiosity. The kind of curiosity that comes dressed as casual interest, but is actually something much more competitive. At some point, late in the evening, the room thinned out. McQueen said something to the effect of, "I want to know if what they say about you is real." Norris didn't react, didn't bristle, didn't posture. He just looked at McQueen the way a very calm man looks at a situation that doesn't require urgency. McQueen pushed further. The precise words that became legend, "Let's settle this with no cameras," have been attributed to him in multiple independent accounts by people who were not comparing notes. That kind of repetition across disconnected sources tends to mean something happened close to what's being described. And Chuck Norris said one word back, "Okay." Stop for a second. Think about what "okay" means when a six-time world karate champion says it. It doesn't mean, "Sure, why not?" It doesn't mean, "if you insist." It means, "I have been here before. I have stood in front of men who wanted to test me, and I'm still standing." Chuck Norris in 1972 had competed against the best fighters in the world and walked away undefeated. He had trained under the most disciplined martial arts systems on Earth. He had spent years building a mind that didn't flinch, didn't hesitate, didn't waste energy on pre-fight theater. When Chuck Norris said "okay," he wasn't agreeing to a fight. He was communicating a certainty. They moved away from the main gathering. Whatever space they used, a back room, a garage, a cleared area, it was away from the lights in the audience. This was the agreement. No cameras, no crowd, no performance. Just two men and the truth. The few people who reportedly followed to watch described it in almost identical terms. Quiet. No trash talk, no circling with raised voices, no Hollywood drama. The men who actually know how to fight don't need that soundtrack. He had trained with Bruce Lee, and Bruce Lee's training wasn't soft. You didn't leave those sessions without something real being deposited in your body. But there is a gap between a man who is trained seriously and a man who has competed, who has stood across from the best in the world, in front of judges and crowds with his record and his identity on the line, and performed under that pressure. That gap is not small. That gap is everything. Accounts of what actually happened in those few minutes vary in their specific details. What's consistent, it didn't last long. McQueen came forward with intent.
He wasn't timid. He wasn't there to feel it out politely. He came to establish something. Norris moved. And here's the thing about watching a world-class martial artist move in a real situation. It looks wrong. It looks like something your brain can't properly file because the speed doesn't match what your nervous system has been trained to anticipate. It's not faster than normal in the way that, say, a fast car is faster than a slow car. It's faster in a way that breaks the formula entirely. McQueen threw, and Norris wasn't there. Not dodged, wasn't there. The spatial relationship changed faster than the intention could track. What followed was brief, controlled, and absolute. Norris didn't hurt McQueen. That was a choice, a deliberate, conscious choice made in a fraction of a second by a man whose entire discipline was the mastery of force and its precise application. He could have. The witnesses made that clear in every account. He chose, instead, to demonstrate. A redirection, a control position, McQueen's arm in a lock that wasn't painful enough to injure, but was absolutely clear in its message. I have you.
5 seconds doesn't sound like much, but 5 seconds with a world karate champion's hands on you is a graduate education. McQueen knew it. You could see it in the way he stood up. Not humiliated, that's the wrong read. McQueen wasn't the kind of man who responded to reality with humiliation. He responded with recalibration. This is actually what separated him from lesser men. He'd asked the question, he'd gotten the answer, and the answer was no. Not no, you can't compete, not no, your training is worthless, not a dismissal. The answer was, what you have and what he has are different things, and right now, in this room, what he has is what matters. McQueen could live with that. Barely, but he could live with it. They walked back into the room separately. Nobody who was watching followed immediately. They gave it a minute, the way you give it a minute when you've witnessed something that deserves space. McQueen poured himself a drink. Chuck Norris didn't say anything about what happened, not that night, not in the years immediately following. This is important. This tells you something about the man. There's a certain type of fighter, the type who wins a private confrontation and then uses it, lets it slip into conversation, lets it circulate, enjoys the currency of it. Norris wasn't that. He came from a discipline that taught restraint not as politeness, but as principle. What happened in the room stayed in the room, because that's where it belonged. It wasn't a story for him. It wasn't ammunition. It was simply a fact, filed and closed. McQueen, for his part, went the other direction. He doubled down on his training. People who knew him in the years following described a subtle but observable shift in how seriously he took the work. He was already serious. He got more serious, like a man who had received specific information and intended to do something with it. Some interpreted this as ego licking its wounds, but that's a shallow read. McQueen was always drawn to the things that humbled him. Racing humbled him, and he raced until his body wouldn't let him. The ocean humbled him. The machines he loved humbled him. He kept coming back. That's not a wounded ego, that's respect. The story didn't circulate publicly for years, and when it did start surfacing, in interviews, in biographies, in the oral history that martial arts communities carry differently than Hollywood does, it came out in fragments, a detail here, a reference there. People who were present making oblique references that only made sense if you already knew what you were looking for. This is actually how the real stories survive. The fabricated legends get told in full, complete, polished narratives from day one. The real ones come out sideways, in footnotes, in the middle of conversations about something else. Someone who was present mentioned it in a magazine interview in the late 1970s, not naming names directly, but describing two men both trained by people close to Bruce Lee, one a champion, one a movie star, and the details matched. Years later, after McQueen's death in 1980, people who had been close to him in that era began speaking more openly. The picture assembled itself slowly. Chuck Norris himself, in various interviews across the decades, has spoken carefully about McQueen, with genuine warmth, with the specific warmth of a man who respected what he saw in someone, not the fame, not the cool exterior, but the thing underneath it, the willingness. He never confirmed the specific incident in the way a tabloid would want, but he never denied the general shape of their relationship, which included its complicated edges.
Here's what I want you to sit with for a second. Chuck Norris never needed that night to mean anything for him. He already knew who he was. He'd known it for years. From the competitive mat, from the dojo, from the years of discipline in Korea, and the years of teaching, and the years of absorbing everything that the martial arts world could throw at him. His identity didn't depend on any single confrontation. That's the mark of a genuine champion. Not the trophies, not the record. The fact that the record doesn't need to be verified every time someone new walks in the room. The men who need to prove themselves are the ones who aren't sure of what they have. To understand why this moment matters beyond the gossip of it, you have to understand what both of these men were chasing. Steve McQueen spent his entire life trying to be real. That's the through line of his career, his obsessions, his relationships. He wanted the cars to be real. He drove them himself. He wanted the stunts to be real. He did them himself. He wanted the danger to be real because nothing false gave him what he needed. He trained with Bruce Lee because Bruce Lee was real. Because in a world full of Hollywood performance, Bruce Lee's hands hitting a pad made an actual sound. He challenged Chuck Norris for the same reason. He needed to know. And what he found out was not a defeat, it was information. Expensive information, the kind that costs you something to obtain, but real. Chuck Norris, on the other side of that equation, represents something different. He committed anyway. And commitment, pursued past the point where most people quit, turns into something that looks a lot like supernatural ability from the outside. That's what Steve McQueen ran into that night. Not talent, not luck, not size or strength. Years. There's one more layer to this story that most people miss. Bruce Lee was the invisible third presence in that room. Both men had trained with him. Both men had felt his hands. Both men had been shaped, in different ways, by the same teacher. And Bruce Lee's core philosophy, his entire Jeet Kune Do principle, was about this exact thing. Not style, not form, not the performance of martial arts. What works? What is real? He built his entire fighting philosophy around eliminating what was ceremonial, what was inherited without questioning, what looked impressive but contained no actual force. He wanted his students to find the truth beneath the tradition. McQueen absorbed some of that. Norris lived it. And in that room, without cameras, without an audience, without the cushioning of performance, the philosophy played itself out in real time. What worked, worked. Chuck Norris went on to become something that almost nobody predicted in 1972. Not just an action star, though he became one of the most iconic in cinema history. Not just a martial arts legend, though his record speaks with a clarity that doesn't need narration. He became a symbol of the quiet man who doesn't announce himself, who doesn't need the room to know his name before he enters it, who carries his ability without a display case. The Chuck Norris jokes that swept the internet decades later were funny for a specific reason. They weren't laughing at him, they were encoding something true about him in the language of absurdity. The jokes worked because there was a core of genuine respect underneath them, a cultural acknowledgement that this man represented a kind of competence that was rare enough to feel mythological. But the mythology started exactly here, in moments like the one described in this story. Private, unrecorded, clean. A question asked without flinching, an answer given without cruelty. Two men finding out something real about each other in the only way that real things get found out. He was 50 years old.
He'd spent his last years racing and riding and pushing his body past what bodies are supposed to survive. He had lived at maximum volume in almost every dimension of his existence. Those who knew him in his last years said he had a peace about him that hadn't always been there, like a man who had asked all his important questions and received his answers, however difficult some of them were. Chuck Norris is still with us, still moving, still training, in the way men who have truly internalized discipline never fully stop. And if you asked him about that night, if you sat down with him and stripped away the celebrity and the legend and the decades of accumulated mythology, you'd probably get something close to what the people who were there described. A quiet man, not looking for credit, not holding any debt, just someone who had been asked a question honestly and answered it honestly. In one word, okay. That word, said in that room, in that way, it's everything you need to know about the difference between confidence and arrogance, between preparation and performance, between the man who announces himself and the man who simply is what he claims to be. Steve McQueen wanted to know if the legend was real. He found out. And in finding out, and asking the question with his body and his willingness rather than with words, he proved something about himself too, that he was built from the same stuff. Different clay, shaped differently, fired in a different kiln, but the same essential thing beneath it all: hunger for the real.